Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to another edition of the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast. I'm your host, William Wolfe. I'm joined today by a very special guest, Caleb Morell, who I count as a friend, a former church member, a brother in Christ. And he has recently written an excellent new book called A Light on the Hill, the surprising story of a local church in the nation's capital. Caleb, I've got this advanced reader copy, so why don't you show folks the nice, newly printed copy?
Oh, I just got it in the mail, so I'm super pumped about this. Crossway just did an incredible job putting this together, so can't wait for you to get your copy, for everyone else to get their copies. They really did a great job on it. All
right, well, congratulations, Caleb. Is this your first solo book?
First book, and hopefully first of many.
First of many. Well, so Caleb, you are an assistant pastor at Capital Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. That's correct?
That's right. Been on staff
right,
here
there's
at
a lot
the church.
more about you.
Sure.
So why don't you just give us some of your biographical information, how you came to be doing what you do today and your history with CHBC.
Sure. Yeah. So I came to this church as a college student back in 2012. William remembers those days well, I'm sure. I grew up in Stockholm, Sweden. My parents are missionaries, and I was born in Wisconsin. In D.C., I just grew a lot as a college student through the impact of Capitol Hill, and joined the church on staff in 2019, and have been working in various roles since then. I now direct our church's internship program, where we train pastors for 5 months. We do a deep dive in ecclesiology and then send them out to the field to work.
I know a little bit about that. It was a joy to be a former CHBC intern myself. And so, what are you, a historian? Are you a writer? What are you? You're a pastor.
Most fundamentally a pastor. I am in a PhD program in history at Midwestern Theological Seminary. And I love history. I love writing. I think there's so much to glean from the past. And it was such a joy to get to pull these stories together and hopefully edify pastors.
Yeah. So what made you want to write a book? Was it just because about CHBC in particular and its long history? Is it just because, you're there at CHBC and you love CHBC, or was there something more that interested you in sort of beginning to put this down?
Yeah, I was really interested in the church's history as a member. And then it really was during COVID when, the mayor came out with her order that churches weren't supposed to be gathering. And we were just like, what are we supposed to do? What have we done in the past? What did we do during the Spanish flu? And so I went down to our archives. I was working as Mark's assistant at the time. And just looked at our records, saw what we did, and some articles came out of that, really just drawing on our church's experience and the broader DC experience of the Spanish flu. And I realized, man, we've got a lot of untapped resources literally in the vault, in our basement, just thousands and thousands of pages of documentation and minutes and notes. And so the idea started percolating of what would it look like to take some of this and turn it into a history. And I think particularly given Mark Dever's pastorate, his legacy over the last 30 years, there's some broader interest. And then just the church being located on Capitol Hill. I started teaching through some of the material for a Sunday school class, and there was just broader interest in the book. And so the church actually set me aside for 2 years to write this book, to make it my full-time job, just to research, write. And this book is the result.
Well, that's fantastic, brother. Well, thank you for your work. And that's interesting, too. I mean, I wonder how many churches out there have a vault of records that could facilitate writing a book like this. And so if you aren't keeping those records, maybe it's time to start doing so. And what was, I was a history undergrad, so I have some interest in history and that process. Tell us a little bit about sort of the historiography of this book. What was it like for you accessing those records, tracking down, corroborating stories? Where else did you have to go? Maybe give us a general overview and then tell us maybe one of your best sort of rabbit trail historical detective excursions as you put this together.
Oh, man, I'm so glad you asked. At first, it was overwhelming because we had this room in the basement, windowless room, where I worked for 2 years with our archives, which were in complete disarray. So just getting organized was overwhelming. I ended up having to create an archive system so that I'd be able to reference and cite the different works. Because it's no good if I read a document and then make notes, but then can never find the document or cite it. So we had to start with creating a box system and folder system and numbering every document. And so that just took a ton of time. We ended up digitizing a lot of it, paying to get it digitized just to make it more accessible. But it was, I couldn't have done it without being able to digitize as much as I did. The biggest find was I found 2 folders of original Carl F.H. Henry documents in the archive, which no one knew existed. Notes from a Sunday school class he taught here in the 1960s, mainly on the threat of communism and the need for evangelicals
fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting. He basically argued that the kind of mainstream liberal Protestant response to communism was completely unable to counter the attack of communism because it was already kind of containing all the germs, the seeds of communism in its liberal theology. So he said, evangelicals, we need to kind of come up with a robust response. And so that was a Sunday school class he was teaching here. Maybe the best historical find outside of our own archives was an unpublished memoir of our first full-time pastor, Joseph Parker. He had written an unpublished memoir. I don't think anyone knew it existed. And I was reading a book by James McPherson about the Civil War, and he mentions in a footnote Joseph Parker. And I think, could that be the same Joseph Parker? Because there's a famous Joseph Parker in England. And so I reach out to him, and he writes me back, and he's like, yes, but I accessed it from a descendant, and that was 70 years ago. And he was like, so she's probably dead. But I was able to track down the memoirs at the University of Virginia, and it shed all kinds of new light on the origins of our church, the background of Baptist churches in D.C. And so that's really chapters 1 and 2 draw on that discovery.
And any plan to publish either Henry's notes on, a Christian response to communism or Joseph Parker's memoirs?
I have thought about both. Yeah. I did a JETS article, a Journal of Evangelical Theological Society on Carl Henry. But yeah, doing something, just kind of publishing all the notes as a freestanding volume would be very interesting.
Well, that's awesome, man. I would look forward to that. Well, let's dive into the history of Capitol Baptist Church, which was not its original name. So, I'll give a sort of like a preface paragraph from your intro here, and then why don't you just kind of walk us through the prayer meeting that started it, and then sort of the official founding of the church. And then there's some very interesting things with the first pastor, Joseph Parker, and then what happened right after. We'll get into that, and then we'll work our way through sort of chronologically. But I like this paragraph from your intro where you say, this is not a story of a perfect church. It contains as many warnings as it does positive examples. There were fights, splits, conflicts, and dissensions. There were contentious members' meetings filled with vitriol and spite. There were as many nights of tearful sowing as there were days of joyful reaping. But throughout seasons of plenty and seasons of scarcity, the light of the gospel has continued to shine on Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm. And that theme, that sort of theme is something, it's obviously in your subtitle, but it's something you repeat regularly throughout the book, the light of the gospel continuing to shine through the ups and downs, which I think that's a helpful sort of honest autopsy or history of a local church. It's not always going to be perfect in any way. But Capitol Baptist Church did not start as Capitol Baptist Church. It started as a Sunday prayer gathering because there were no Baptist churches essentially east of the Capitol in the mid 1800s. Is that correct?
That's right. And so, a newlywed couple, Abraham and Celestia Ferris, called together their friends to pray for a Baptist church. It's interesting. They didn't just want a generic church. They wanted a Baptist church on Capitol Hill. And you think, man, what foresight. Back in 1867, really before this area had grown up much. I mean, it was called Jenkins Farm. It was an open space, some houses, but not a lot of people living there. And they started praying. That prayer meeting lasted for years. They eventually started a Sunday school to evangelize kids in the neighborhood. A lot of 19th century Baptist churches would get started out of Sunday schools. That'd be kind of the initial impetus to organize people together. And it took 11 years for that Sunday school to become a church. They formed an association just as a way of holding property in 1874, and then they completed a building in 1876. So the steps were prayer meeting, Sunday school, building, covenanting as a church. Very interesting.
And also they formed an association first,
Yeah.
right? A Metropolitan Baptist Association that didn't even have a single church in it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So think less of like a local association and more like just an organization to hold property. They needed a legal
Okay.
entity to hold funds to make a purchase. So that association dissolved once the church was formed.
Yeah, and that was between 1876 and 1878.
Yeah.
And so from the time of the prayer service to the official covenanting of the Metropolitan Baptist Church, it was over a decade.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, so very patient.
And the Pharisees were there at the covenanting ceremony. Yes, they were a part of it.
Yeah, that's right. So, except Abraham Ferris, Celestia's husband, actually died 1 year before the church covenanted. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and it seems like he died from wounds, injuries from war. But Celestia Ferris remained a member until her death in 1924.
1924. I don't know if you've seen online every now and then there's this funny meme about Tabasco. Apparently Tabasco was founded during the Civil War, and people are like, somehow during the Civil War, somebody thought, what we need right now? A great hot sauce. But similarly, the Metropolitan Baptist Church really was founded out of the Civil War era period. Anything interesting from that in terms of its founding that sort of was part of the church's culture as it went forward?
Yeah, I mean, I try to capture in the first chapter just how difficult the war was on every denomination, every church, and in DC in particular, the churches were just completely divided over the question of secession, supporting the North, supporting the South. Again, this is the national capital. And so you had representatives here from all over the country. And so deep division. And what do we take from that? I asked one historian of the significance of our church being formed, a DC historian, and he said the significance this is the first church that was formed by the Baptist churches of DC who had splintered during the Civil War. So the churches splintered, and they came back together after the war, and we're the first church that they come together to support. And so in the churches that our initial 31 members come from, you have churches that literally divided during the Civil War, kind of coming back to being represented again. So I think there may have been a sense, even though everyone at the church initially was, would have come from Union or Northern states, there was still a sense of a broader purpose that the church had, and a sense of responsibility in the post-war era.
So tell us a little bit about the first pastor, Parker. Joseph Parker.
So we had an interim who served kind of like on a weekly basis named Stephen Myrick, who has his own interesting story. But Joseph Parker was our first regular or full-time pastor, and he was one of the most decorated Baptist statesmen of his generation. He had pastored some very prominent churches in Boston, most notably First Baptist Church of Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I think Cambridge, Mass, home of Harvard University. He had been pastor there for decades. He organized the New England Aid Society to freedmen during the Civil War. So this would have been aid to refugee camps for formerly enslaved persons who were considered military contraband. And he organized schools, colleges, training teachers. And so that work frequently brought him through D.C. It frequently brought him into contact with Abraham Lincoln, who he met with on more than one occasion. And it also brought him into the fractured Baptists of Washington, D.C. And he played a significant role in brokering peace, so to speak, among the Baptists in D.C., including it seems, and I recount the story he tells in his memoir, leading one of the wealthiest men in D.C., a guy named Amos Kendall, who was Postmaster General under Andrew Jackson, convincing him that through faith in Christ he needs to be baptized. And so Parker just has this remarkable ministry. And then his final pastorate in D.C. is this little church that just got started on Capitol Hill. And he says in his memoirs, he had no reason, humanly speaking, for taking this pastorate. I mean, it had nothing. He cut his salary in half in order to take the pastorate. And you think as like a 78-year-old or something like that, taking on that kind of work, like getting this this church plant started. It's almost unthinkable. And he said the reason he took it was a church rightly formed. It wasn't formed through strife or division. It was rightly formed the way a church should be formed. And he thought that we might not be able to survive without him. So we're grateful for his legacy and impact. He certainly gave the church an initial stability for our first few years.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that church planting or church revitalization is a young man's game, so to speak. But Parker took this as a seasoned veteran, essentially. Interesting note, this delegation from Metropolitan Baptist Church comes to him and visits him right after he had fallen. I guess it was like icing his leg, or he fell on ice.
Yeah.
And he says, "There's no reason I would take this, but I told the Lord I would follow him essentially to the ends of the earth. If he called me to ministry." And his seasoned hand really helped establish Metropolitan Baptist Church until I think he left there in 1882, something like that. And one other thing I found particular of note, and I think of note to Baptists and pastors from this very early sort of stages of Metropolitan Baptist Church, you write that there are two lessons worth highlighting. First, stability from a seasoned and faithful pastor. We've just touched on that. The second one was the importance of church polity. And if you've been around the Nine Marks world, or you've listened to Mark Dever or any of his acolytes, obviously this has been a big focus of Mark's. But as Mark has regularly said, I'm not here to tell you anything new. I'm here to help try to remind Baptists what we have historically done. So Caleb, what did you find that was of note of the way that this church sort of covenanted together and the thought they put into their church polity and governing structure as a Baptist church?
Yeah, so the first thing we did is adopt a statement of faith and church covenant, and then we put together a church manual, which is basically rules for how we were going to operate as a Baptist church. And that included things like membership, discipline, and that was faithfully practiced under Parker's leadership. If you've studied church discipline or church membership in Baptist churches in the 19th and 20th century, like Greg Will's monumental study, Democratic Religion, that there's a decline. There's a massive decline in church discipline and meaningful membership being practiced in Baptist churches in the 20th century. But at least in the 19th century, our church was faithfully practicing discipline, even in our first few years. And it may sound surprising, but church plants encounter the most challenging situations. And if you don't have your documents in hand, if you're not teaching membership, if you're a church of 30 or 40 people, it can really get torn to shreds by just a few people making trouble. And we had several difficult cases of church discipline, even in just the first 6 to 8 years. And yet our commitment to the Bible's teaching and the careful teaching of Parker and others, and the shared agreement on what to do when those cases come, I think enabled us to keep going.
Yeah, so if you're a church planter here in 2025, don't think you know better than what these Baptists were doing in 1867, 1870, whatever. They focused on polity. I mean, you say here that they did not regard these documents as of nominal importance, but spent months deliberately drafting them so they could stand the test of time. And it seems like they have.
And let me just tell you one crazy the craziest church discipline story that I came across. It's unbelievable. It's maybe the 1880s or 90s. There's a guy in the church who gets married, and a few years into, just weeks into his wedding, his wife's reporting that he's like staying up till like 2 a.m, 4 a.m, never coming home. And there's rumors circulating that he's visiting a house of ill fame. So he's visiting a prostitute. And what happens is, a medical examiner comes to the church deacons, and along with a health insurance or a life insurance officer, and they say, "Hey, this member of your church sought to take out a life insurance policy, naming a known prostitute as the beneficiary in case of death." And they're like, "We know he's a member of your church. We just wanted you to know, here's his signed up, here's the signed application." So we have in our records, we have in our basement, a life insurance policy application that these guys came to our church because they said, "Hey, this is a member of your church in good standing. You should know that he just essentially admitted that this inappropriate relationship is happening. And because he's a member of your church, you should do something about it." And sure enough, we called him before the church, and he was excommunicated as an act of discipline for his unrepentance. And it's interesting that in the 19th century, the church had such a reputation that even non-members would be aware of who was a member of the church or not, and they would expect that the members of that church were going to be held to higher standards. So just some crazy documents and stories that we had in our records.
Yeah, so the polity is important, obviously, and we see that right away. And at the end of Parker's tenure, though, as you tell in the history, things sort of went south really fast, right? So if you think of, there was this decade of work and prayer, answered prayers, a Sunday school, a church covenant together, Metropolitan Baptist Church. You get the seasoned guy, Joseph Parker, in to lead it. He has to move on. And then immediately there's division, there's outstanding debts, there's a search for a new pastor. What happened there, and how did they sort of recover back to stability?
Yeah, the church was growing, and we wanted to build a second larger building. And there was debate over how much debt to take on. It sounds like a mundane matter, but this quickly became a source of division. The pastor and treasurer wanted to take on a lot of debt, but we were in the middle of a recession as a country, and we could barely make interest payments on the debt. We almost lost our building, which we had to put down as collateral. And so the church voted to sell the debt-laden property that was, in their words, quickly becoming a noose around our necks. The pastor and treasurer kind of refused and kind of forced a decision. They kind of dug their heels in, and eventually it ended with the church asking him to resign by a narrow majority vote. He then left with the treasurer and about half the members and formed a rival church a block and a half away.
Was that East Capitol Baptist Church?
Yeah, so they called themselves East Capitol Street Baptist Church, and a very difficult situation. So that's 1884, just 6 years into our church's existence. We almost go under, but the members resolved. This was one of the most moving parts of the story. They didn't respond in kind. They passed a resolution saying that we would endeavor to only speak charitably of them and to relate to them as Christians. When they asked to use our baptistry, because they didn't have a building to meet in, we allowed them to use our baptistry. Later, when they covenanted as a church, they invited our members to come, and we encouraged our members to go. And I think, that church existed until the 1970s. They eventually moved out to the suburbs. The building was sold, turned into condos. But it just shows how, through a very difficult situation, the Lord can sustain a church, in that it's possible to choose forgiveness and reconciliation over, kind of vendettas and vengeance.
Yeah, so there's essentially a church split, a crisis early on, the first decade of the life of Metropolitan Baptist Church. They respond well. They recover from it, and really that recovery, it seems, was fostered through bringing John Compton Ball on. I guess I'm kind of skipping it. Was Green Clay Smith before? Yeah,
there were a few pastors in between, but Ball really brought the stability that we needed in the 20th century.
And when was he? So Green Clay Smith is a fascinating character in the history of Metropolitan Baptist Church too. He's the nephew or great nephew of Henry Clay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he pastored there for about 5 years.
Clay.
Yeah. And then, and he brought some stability as well. But then it was talk to us a little bit about the tenure of John Compton Ball, when he came, when he left, and particularly most notable to me is really it was under his leadership that the building that we all think of in terms of when we picture CHBC was constructed, correct? In 1912, that was before he left.
So John Compton Ball comes in 1903. He's an Englishman. He pastors the church for 41 years, so he gives it remarkable stability. He leads the project to build our current building, which was built between 1911 and 1912, completed right before the sinking of the Titanic, just to situate you historically. He faithfully preaches the gospel. He seems to be a pretty idiosyncratic character. It's hard to really get a feel for him, because on the one hand, he is one of the early signatories calling for a conference on Baptist fundamentals in 1919, which gives rise to the kind of fundamentalist movement, and the Baptist Bible Union, which is a fascinating organization, which was an alliance of Southern Baptists, Northern Baptists, and Canadians who all affirmed the fundamentals of the faith to fight for theological conservatism within their denominations. So if that sounds familiar, William, it's because this work's still going on. But he's one of these early leaders calling for this. And actually, CHBC is host site for the Conference on Baptist Fundamentals, the pre-convention conference for the Northern Baptist Convention in 1926. We're like the host. And so all the kind of big fundamentalists of the day are here preaching. So you got that on one side. And then you have this female traveling evangelist named Amy Lee Stockton. I don't know if you remember her, who's regularly preaching in our pulpit in the 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, I saw that. Very interesting.
And so Ball's kind of one of these guys where I think he was theologically conservative. I think, so he kind of fits that broader movement. And yet he seemed idiosyncratic. And what I say, we can talk about this later, but I think it made for intergenerational instability. So when you have a large figure, especially someone who builds a church and they bring it notoriety, they can carry internal inconsistencies within their big personality, but it's going to make for intergenerational instability. And afterwards, the church is going to need to decide which direction they're going in.
Sure. I mean, that's very interesting and true in terms of the larger positioning at this time, Metropolitan Baptist Church, which, and this is interesting too, they are still part of the Northern Baptist Association, right? So many people associate Capital Baptist Church with the Southern Baptist, which they are a part of currently, but for the first 70 years or so, when did they leave the Northern Baptist?
Yeah, it seemed gradual. So just to set the stage here, we were most fundamentally a member of our local association. That's kind of how Baptists used to think of themselves. Not kind of we're part of this national organization, but we're part of our local association. And so our local association was the District of Columbia Baptist Churches, or the Columbia Association of Baptist Churches, it was called. And that was the only state convention. DC is not a state, but it was the only state convention which was duly affiliated with both Northern and Southern Baptist conventions. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so through that local convention, we were part of both. And so we'd often send delegates to both Northern and Southern Baptist conventions. But our constituency as a church was becoming more and more Southern. Southern whites were moving up to D.C. during the Great Depression for work, for jobs. This was a poor part of the city to live in. And so our population is just booming with Southern Baptists joining the church in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Okay.
So we eventually designate our giving to the local association to not give any money to the Northern Baptist Convention in the 1940s.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were concerned about compromise with the Federal Council of Churches in the 1940s.
And so this is all happening under John Compton Ball, and he's got 40 years of tenure there. And so they build the building that, again, we would recognize, put in these stained glass windows honoring some of the founding members of, the prayer meeting and the Sunday school, including the Pharisees. And he was taking a stand against modernism, on behalf of the fundamentals. What was his ministry at the church like there, though? So what characterized his ministry would be one question. And then when they build the building, you note that it was built to seat 1,000. But what was the membership at the time? At what point did they actually fill that building out? Just give us some of the internal dynamics of his ministry and the life of Metropolitan Baptist Church in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. And what I do know comes from a direct descendant who I tracked down through newspaper clippings and weddings and funerals. So I went to her house out in Virginia. I eventually just kind of was calling around trying to get in touch, and I found a direct descendant, and they had kept just boxes of his materials, sermon excerpts, photos, handwritten notes. So I was able to learn a good bit about his ministry. I mean, he was a gifted preacher, and he was kind of a showman, entertainer. He'd come up with these really creative sermon outlines and kind of really tacked to the news cycle, very evangelistic. I think he was really beloved by the members. His wife died when she was fairly young, and so he was a widower for most of his ministry. Just seemed to have a really fun personality, gifted preacher.
Was the church practicing membership according to their polity and doctrine during his time?
I don't think he was particularly careful with that kind of thing. So the church was growing. I don't get the sense that we were tracking membership super seriously. I mean, you'd come forward, I think, at the end of the service to kind of pledge membership, which was becoming pretty common in Southern Baptist churches. You would receive a New Testament, and the pastor would write a life verse in the front. He'd pick out a unique life verse for every incoming member. So thousands of people around the country have these, little pocket New Testaments that John Compton Ball would give out on joining the church. Yeah, but I don't get the sense that he was particularly doctrinal, although he was conservative theologically.
Hmm.
I think it was more evangelistic.
Gotcha. And what was the membership by the time he left?
By the time he left, it's in the thousands. I
Okay.
don't have the number, right in front of me, but it'd probably be like 1,900 members or so.
So
Because
they
when
preached the building full.
they preached the building full, and it would, I mean, particularly on Easter, 1,300 people would be sitting there. The church had a massive Sunday school ministry. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. And so this was, I mean, under his ministry, the church really grew to prominence. It's funny, you know, I say like not very doctrinal and not, but then again, I found this really interesting article by a Louisiana congressman named Asa Leonard, who wrote back to his home district in 1926 describing the church. And he's the one who says the quote, "No modernism at all would be tolerated at this church." And he gives it like a thumbs up. He says the church is very careful about its membership. He says the church is very careful about what it teaches. It won't allow anyone to teach Sunday school unless they've been thoroughly vetted and examined. So, it's hard to get an exact picture, but certainly by the standards of the time, I think the church was doing pretty well.
And as it stands today, given that Mark's tenure is still in the 30-ish years, John Compton Ball is the longest continuous serving pastor of Metropolitan Baptist Church,
41
now
years.
Capital Baptist Church. That's great. Yeah, very interesting. And he was the one who was he the one sort of leading their effort in the temperance movement?
Yeah, so it was Green Clay Smith was most well known for temperance in the 1890s, even running for president for the Temperance Party in 1876.
Okay.
Yeah, but John Compton Ball would have supported temperance as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, from those first half of your book, I mean, it's clear to me that CHB, Metropolitan Baptist Church, was not shy about engaging in political and social issues from its perch there on Capitol Hill, and they seem to even feel like they had a responsibility to do that as Christians. Is that a fair read?
I think so. Even Joseph Parker would talk about enjoying a short range shot as a pastor, meaning he could preach something in the pulpit Sunday and it would reach its intended target, he says, and sometimes bring them down that very week. Even if they weren't at church, they'd just hear about it. So he was calling out corruption. He was calling out immorality. Green Clay Smith, especially, I mean, if you look at his sermons, he was very clear that that the laws of the land should reflect the laws of God, that apart from a vital Christianity, there was little hope for American democracy and its Republican experiment enduring. As I think there was a strong sense of that. Under John Compton Ball, I don't find quite as much evidence of that, and I wonder how much I don't want to overplay this, but I wonder how much of kind of growing dispensationalism, how much kind of emerging fundamentalism was, shifting the focus a little bit of the church, off of, because it's not that John Compton was preaching the gospel more than kind of earlier pastors. I mean, they were all preaching the gospel. It just seemed like the focus shifted a little bit more towards kind of entertainment or kind of evangelistic entertainment, less than kind of tackling the big pictures of the day. Now, with that said, so let me give you an example. John Compton Ball was all against the U.S. entering World War I. He was all about peace, not war, and just emphatic. And then the moment the U.S. declares war, he just completely shifts his tune and is like, war at all costs. We must have victory. And it's a little hard to figure out what to do with that, but it sounds like he's kind of more going with the flow than setting the tone. That's the sense I got, at least. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't speak to that, though. I can't say in general, it's good to stay out of a fight, but once you're in it, you should try to win it. I don't know if that was his thinking behind it, but, okay, so he wraps up his tenure in the early 1940s, 44. Yep. And then you get into talking about sort of, and it's still Metropolitan Baptist Church at this time. You kind of get into the Billy Graham era of evangelicalism. And, and Metropolitan Baptist Church role in that. So, after him, the pastors start to sort of come and go with less of a lengthy tenure until we get to sort of one of the last guys before Dever. So, take us through from the early 1940s. Maybe to the last guy before Dever, and we'll get to him, and just walk us through the life of Capital Baptist Church, what was happening internally, the ministry there, and how they were situating themselves in the broader evangelical and Baptist conversations in America.
Yeah, so just picture this kind of growing wave throughout the 1900s, kind of peaking after World War II in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, just kind of going down. And that was the story of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. That was the story of just about every urban church in the 20th century. So if you look at any church history in a kind of major urban center, most churches went through the same experience. So this was almost universal. And it says something both about American culture and what we were going through. It also says something about, urbanization. This is like well studied by sociologists and scholars of urban studies and Aaron Wrenn and those kind of people. But we definitely peaked in the 1950s with all, kind of just this sense of the existential threats the country was facing, the existential threats that the world was facing because of communism, and the need to have a shared moral vision as a nation. And you see this in Billy Graham. You see this in a lot of the preaching that's happening in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, there's kind of growing anti-war movements, Vietnam, there's the civil rights, so all these things start creating both factions within the church broadly, within church in particular, and result in suburbanization. And our church just experienced a massive decline of its membership. And so it was this church that had kind of experienced this greatness in the 50s. We were the host church for Billy Graham in 1952, and then it's just kind of slow decline. And that really continued throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Even very faithful pastors who, despite
can
their
I pause
faithfulness,
there and bring up something interesting from that period? So this is so then when did Walter Pegg come on?
Yeah, exactly. So Pegg is 1956 to 1961.
Okay, so on page, at least in my copy, on page 187 and 188, I thought this was interesting. During this period, and you set the stage well here in terms of the contextualization of the issues going on, declining membership, it does seem like Pegg was at least attempting to be faithful and trying to understand what church membership meant.
Yes.
What does it mean to Baptists? What does it mean according to the New Testament? I like this on page 188. You say, in light of these responses about growing indifference in church membership there at Metropolitan Baptist Church, he says he presses the church to consider, what does church membership mean? What should it involve? A place where the name is inscribed, a place associated with pleasant memories. And Pegg turns his congregation's attentions to Hebrews 10:25. Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as is the manner of some. So walk us through a little bit about Pegg's efforts to sort of, this is fascinating. It's like every generation has to recover. What does it mean to practice faithful church membership? And Pegg had to do that in a very interesting period there in the 1950s.
Yeah. So, kind of like from the perspective of the present, there's kind of the infamous Mark Dever dropping 256 names from the church membership rolls in the 1996. He published an article for Christianity Today, Why We Discipline Half Our Church. And yet you go back at our church history, and he wasn't the first to do this. I mean, K.O.N. White did this when he came, very concerned about the fact that the attendance in church membership rolls did not line up at all. And Pegg did the same thing. So Walter Pegg came and he had the church drop 995 names from its membership rolls at a single members meeting. And, and it wasn't just
say that one more time, Caleb.
995 names.
Wow.
And it
almost could have been a smooth 1,000.
I know. If we just find 5 more. But just think about the amount of work that's going on. I mean, they're literally trying to track these people down and trying to care for them because they took a covenant with each other to love and care for each other, and just a ton of work. And so you have really faithful pastors like Pegg pastoring the church during a time of of transition, suburbanization, and you can be a faithful. As Peg preached expositionally, he took membership seriously, faithful pastor, and yet the church was experiencing decline. So was Peg's ministry a failure? I asked that question at the end. No, I mean, so I love contrasting a guy named Caleb White, who was Ball's successor, 1944 to 1949, and Peg, 56 to 61, because both did largely the same things: preached expositionally, took membership seriously. And yet, whereas Caleb White was just leading the church through this massive surge, he baptized 848 people in 5 years. I mean, talk about revival, 848 baptisms. And, Peg was doing all the same things. It's just, the country was going through a different time. The church was going through a different time. The city was going through a different time. And so Peg was just as faithful, and yet just didn't see the same results, which is a reminder to us of, what we're pursuing ultimately isn't being able to see the success in our own lifetime, but faithfully serving in the context where the Lord has us and trusting that the Lord will do good through our feeble efforts in time.
Yeah, well, Caleb, this makes me think of something, and I just like to offer this encouragement to pastors listening to this, and feel free to chime in and give your own perspective on it. But it is just as faithful to the Lord in your service as a shepherd to remove 995 errant members that you can no longer, very proactively and in a thoughtful manner affirm their profession of faith, as it is to baptize 884 new believers, right? So like those two numbers, I think in a modern American church mindset would stand as sort of sharp contradiction to each other. Baptizing 800 plus, that's very faithful. Removing 900, that's terrible. But both of those big numbers, what Peg and was it White?
Yeah, White
did was an exercise of being a faithful shepherd of a church.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah. Okay, so Peg and is Carl Henry's there at this time, right?
So
or he's kicking around.
Yeah, he gets there in 1956.
Okay, so where did the church go after Peg? And tell us a little bit too about Carl Henry's involvement with Capitol Hill Baptist Church. I mean, he's obviously a very well-known figure in all of evangelicalism. He was a Southern Baptist. I think a lot of the newer generations don't really know too much about who he was. So, just give us some of the history of Carl F.H. Henry's involvement with Capitol Hill Baptist Church or Metropolitan Baptist Church, from the mid 20th century onward.
Yeah, so he was, a major theologian of the 20th century. He, was associated with kind of Billy Graham and the efforts at Fuller, and the kind of the efforts to kind of construct a post-war evangelical identity out of fundamentalism as an alternative to liberalism. So this is the Fuller Seminary, National Association of Evangelicals, Christianity Today, the Evangelical Theological Society. So all these institutions, and we can sit here and talk about how well it worked out for them or not. But anyway, this was an effort to form institutions united around the doctrine of inerrancy of Scripture, largely as kind of the defining issue of the time, and seek to kind of provide an alternative to the mainstream evangelicalism and then kind of fundamentalism in retreat. He came to D.C. in 1956 to found Christianity Today. He was the founding editor, and his office literally overlooked the White House. On 15th Street, he felt he was looking down on the White House, and that kind of captures something of his vision. When he got here, he immediately tried to get a list of congressmen and their religious affiliation. He was here on a mission to make an impact. And a lot of that involved church membership and faithfully serving at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. He started a Sunday school class in the 1960s, which he called the Hilltoppers. It was kind of an invite-only worldview training for
at Metropolitan Baptist Church.
Yeah, at the church. They met in the pastor study. And, this is where his kind of discussion of communism was coming into play. And he was a faithful member of the church until the 2000s, and really played a significant role in helping call many of the church's pastors in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, including Mark Dever.
Yeah, well, that would be a fascinating conversation for another day, Caleb. When you list those organizations that Carl F.H. Henry founded, I mean, National Association of Evangelicals, Christianity Today, Fuller Seminary, not exactly bastions of faithful conservative Orthodox theology and practice, right? Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Kind of one thing that I've chewed on is just sort of the idea that a retrospective on a lot of Carl Henry's work is that inerrancy is never quite enough. Inerrancy is not enough. That cannot be the only guardrail. But that's a conversation for another day, but very interesting.
Yep.
So he's a faithful member there. And then the sort of, when did they change the name?
To push in there, William, a little bit. It's kind of also that the conversation's always changing.
Sure.
So there's this kind of like old wine, new wine skins issue, where the defining issue of the 1920s isn't going to be the defining issue of the 1950s, and it's not going to be the defining issue of the 2000s. And so it's not, we got to watch out that we're not protecting orthodoxy from new threats using old orthodoxy alone. The new threats need to be countered and responded to.
Yeah. So during this period, they changed their name to the Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church. What brought that about?
1963. I'm not sure. Well, you know what? I mean, there's one story I was told. So there was an African American church, also called Metropolitan Baptist Church, located up at R Street. So same name. Okay. And whether this is true or not, I heard that a kind of a busload of youth who were coming into DC for a march showed up outside the door at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, very white 1960s Capitol Baptist Church. And they thought they were going to experience one thing on Sunday morning. They experienced something very different. And there's maybe a little bit of a sense of like, all right, we're confusing people here. Whether that's the reason or a reason, I don't know. But in any case, the church added Capitol Hill to its name, so it became Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church in 1963.
Yeah. So, anything particularly noteworthy from your book that you want to share with the listeners about how Metropolitan Baptist Church and the Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church navigated the civil rights era and the racial tension during that time?
Yeah, it's complex. I mean, the watchword in history is complexity. So thankfully, I think this story resists ideological oversimplification. And what you're getting is more just kind of reality. So
what was the reality?
Yeah, I think the reality was, and we have Carl Henry writing on this, is that he said Metropolitan is at a crossroads. He wrote this, I think, in 1967. He says, what you have is an urban church that kind of had its heyday in the past, but is struggling to orient itself to a changing city with changing racial dynamics, complexities. And he says it needs intellectual preaching, and it needs creative leadership on racial issues. I mean, the church had to decide if at that point we hadn't had any African Americans in our membership, and the church wasn't opposed to that. It's just it hadn't been done. And these are kind of big shifts for churches to experience in the 20th century. And I think it can be easy for us to look back kind of from on our high horse from the privileged perspective of the present and kind of look down at people. But, there were real challenges. And so the church brought in its first African-American member in 1969. And it's a beautiful story. Her name was Mrs. Margaret Roy. She heard the church's hymns on the radio, and I think she had heard about it from a friend, but she liked listening to the services, and she liked the singing. It fit her aesthetic style. She said it was different from Black churches where there's a lot of clapping. She said she just preferred the simple singing and gospel preaching. And she faced some real hostility when she just started attending the church. Some people were rude to her. Some people turned their backs on her, but she was just determined to kill people with kindness and not respond in kind. She said that many people who initially were rude toward her later became really good friends. She just adopted the practice of visiting people in their homes. And so she'd call on elderly women and just bring them a meal and get to know them. And she just had a remarkable impact on the church. And I love that, some of the names that get surfaced in the book, some of the heroes are these faithful women like Celestia Ferris, Margaret Roy. And so, the church certainly went through its ups and downs during the 1960s and 70s, but the Lord preserved our witness and he kept the light shining.
When she joined, they weren't officially, they didn't support segregation, right? As a church, you were welcome to join as an African-American member.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And, again, but at the time, there were churches that were not adopting that policy, including some prominent churches, and it was still a live issue.
Sure.
And the church, I get into this, it's complicated, but the church planted a kind of mission in Southeast DC in Anacostia that the church was supporting. And at this mission chapel, so not at kind of our location here on Capitol Hill, but at the mission chapel, the services were segregated in the kind of early 1960s. So there would be and it wasn't forced, it was just encouraged. So there'd be a majority white service in the morning and predominantly a black service in the afternoon. So not yet a church, but it was a mission chapel, and that came under criticism. And I outlined this in the book, but it was actually after MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail that our pastor, R.B. Colbreth, who was a Birmingham native, he preached a sermon at the church, and he came out in favor of desegregation. And we know this because we have a letter in our archives. So I found a letter from Carl Henry in our archives in that packet, writing to the pastor, thanking him for his sermon and saying, I'm glad you came out as strong as you did in favor of desegregation, and that's to your credit. And then he said, I don't share all your optimism about MLK, which that's interesting, come from Carl Henry, but he appreciated the pastor's strong statements. And after that, sometime shortly after that, the services at the chapel were desegregated. So that's just a little bit of kind of the complexity of what was going on at the time that I recount in the book.
So by the time we hit the early 1980s, we can kind of fast forward. There's a lot more you can get into in the book. Limited time in this conversation, of course. By the time we hit the early 1980s, before they call Harry Kilbride, no, this is about a decade before they call Harry Kilbride. So just because Harry Kilbride is a pretty notable individual, the last pastor to serve before Mark Dever comes. But before you get to him, what's going on at Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church in the 1980s? Who's the most notable pastor during that time? How are they sort of growing and processing sort of the Cold War era? What do things look like there?
Walt Tommy was our pastor at the time. It's interesting. Before Walt Tommy, we had a guy named Wade Freeman who left to go work for the Reagan administration because the deputy head of PPO was a member. And she hired Wade Freeman to go work for Reagan. So that's its own interesting story. But we had a guy named Walt Tommy Jr. in the 1980s, and he was called as the associate to this guy who then his first day in the office, the former pastor tells him, oh, by the way, I'm taking a job in the administration. You're going to be the next senior pastor. And, Walt felt like it was an uphill climb. He felt like the church was calcified, which is kind of often the case in kind of a church that has once had a heyday. It's like, we've always done this program. We've always done it this way. We got to get back to making the Baptist, youth program great again, and not kind of really like changing and adapting. And so that was Walt Tommy's experience. And he ended up leaving in a lot of disappointment in the late 80s. Over the church's unwillingness to change. And that was a real low point. Actually, people who stayed felt like 1988, when Walt Tommy left, was in some ways even worse than when Harry Kilbride resigned over moral failure. Because a lot of the young people left with Walt to go form a non-denominational, more seeker-sensitive church in the suburbs. So you got
that's
Walt Tommy.
Interesting, Caleb. That's almost a century after sort of the first big, like, is this thing going to work or not? After their first pet Parker leaves, debt division, church split, a century later. So actually, let me ask you this: if you can sort of like pull the camera out on the life of this church, which, as you know, paid very close attention to its founding documents, cared a lot about church polity and practice and membership and discipline and doctrinal fidelity. 100 years later, and really this begins to set the stage for what Mark Dever does with his reform of the church, trying to get it back to its roots. Where did they lose that? Kind of where did that, was it through the boom of the mid 20th century? When did they sort of stop being so careful in their ecclesiological practices that it gets sort of calcified and stagnant like this?
I'm not sure exactly. And in some ways, they never entirely, I don't want to overstate it.
Mhm.
But I mean, definitely in the 1960s, I mean, I've got a letter where an elderly member is trying to resign, and we're like, oh, can we please keep you on the rolls? We really like having people who've been members for like over 70 years. And so can we just keep you on the rolls? So you got things like that happening. I think it's gradual. I think for a lot of the second half of the 20th century, you just don't have that consistent, stable leadership. So you think that gift that John Compton Ball left 41 years, and you just have you don't have anything quite like that. The longest pastorate, I think, is 8 years in the second half of the 20th century. So I would just emphasize pastoral stability. Pastoral stability is both a sign of health and often a contributor to health. And so if you're listening to this and you're a pastor, pray that the Lord would enable you to stay. If it's, there's nothing wrong with leaving a church and going somewhere else, but pastoral stability and continuity is such a gift to a church.
And I would assume, just like many other Baptist churches during that time period, the second half of the 20th century, the sort of post-Billy Graham evangelistic explosion in our country, careful church membership, really even like a careful understanding of the doctrine of salvation. Like what does it mean to be a professing Christian in a discernible way beyond just responding to an altar call at a church or at a rally, has sort of been lost, and the church is sort of flowing along with that. So then let's touch briefly on what brings us to the present day, and the call of Mark Dever to the church in 1993, which is what most people familiar with just modern day CHBC history would be aware of. Not everything else we've just covered, which is fascinating. Sort of the last pastor before Dever was Henry Kilbride, there for 2 years. How did he end up there? Who was he? And then you can touch briefly on the sort of disastrous conclusion of his pastoral tenure there.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, that he had orthodoxy, but he didn't have orthopraxy. And unfortunately, there was a moral failure involved that led to his resignation in 1993 and left the church very battered and bruised. And so when Mark was called to the church in 1994, it didn't look like a kind of very healthy, flourishing church. It looked like a church that had been through a real rough time. And they had, and yet I think Mark saw the strategic nature of the church, the strategic location, the opportunity. I think obviously Carl Henry being there, but also I think just a vision for what the Lord could do. It may have seen that the things were over for the church, but things were just getting started.
Yeah. So Mark comes in 1993. How many people are in attendance regularly at CHBC when Mark Dever takes over?
Attendance. Yeah.
100. I mean, and so essentially growth that through the first 60, 70 years, precipitous decline. Mark takes over in 1993. And what was his ministry strategy? How did he approach becoming the next pastor of the Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church?
Yeah. In his Q&A with the congregation before they called him, he said he was committed to 4 things, and that was preaching, praying, loving, and staying. He wanted to preach the word. He was going to pray and trust that if something was going to happen, the Lord would have to do it. He had no kind of brilliant ideas. He was going to love by evangelizing and discipling, and he was going to stay. He was committed to being there as long as the Lord would have him.
And what were some of the other notable things that Dever did in terms of like the governance and the polity of the church?
Yeah, he had written a letter when he founded a church outside of Topsfield, Massachusetts as a seminarian, and he had written a letter to them explaining what to look for in a pastor, and it was 9 characteristics, and those 9 marks or characteristics of what to look for in a pastor, he sent those to Capitol Hill Metropolitan as kind of an example of what he believed. And those things included things like meaningful membership, church discipline, expositional preaching. And later, of course, that became the heart of 9 Marks Ministries when that was formed. But that also defined his kind of approach to church leadership. So one thing he taught them was that he was going to introduce, he hoped to introduce elder leadership in the church, which came through constitutional amendment a few years into his pastorate, and then eventually in him nominating the church's first slate of elders in 1998, which proved a source of controversy. I talk about this in the book, but maybe kind of that defining moment in his first 5 years was when he put the first 5 elders forward, and they narrowly failed to meet the constitutionally required 2/3 threshold. They all failed, or it was 3/4 threshold, so even higher. So none of them hit 75%. They were all somewhere between 67 and 74%. And he thought about it, prayed about it, but these were the men that he understood to be elder qualified, and there weren't others who he could put forward, and so he put the same 5 back up, and the church accepted them that time, and that was a real turning point in kind of defining the direction of the church, the shared ministry philosophy and direction going forward.
Yeah, and that was a change, I would say, a historical recovery of Baptist polity, which is an elder-led church according to the office that we see in the New Testament, versus a deacon-led church, right? That we understand the office of deacon to be fundamentally an office of stewardship and service in the church, not the same as an elder. But and a lot of Baptist churches are still sort of deacon ruled, right? And this is part of that recovery, is bringing in essentially congregationally ruled but elder led, church back to Capitol Hill.
That's right.
Yeah. And so Mark Dever's been there for 30 years now, and he's grown the church back from 100 plus people when he took over to, essentially 1,000 now. Many people know CHBC has helped plant other churches in the area. As you did this historical survey, what would you say you've seen as sort of the secret to Mark's success, if we want to put it in those terms? I know Mark might not like those terms, right? But versus of the standard church class consultants of our day and age.
Yeah, I think the big thing has been his passion for raising up leaders and discipling. I think that's just his multiplying his life. That characterized him before he came to Capitol Baptist Church, and it's characterized him since. I think his desire to hand out authority, to hand it off, to believe in other people, and encourage them to grow has really shaped the ministry over the last 30 years. Less kind of consolidating power, more giving it out. And I really try to highlight that in the last chapter of the book, doing nothing and planting churches. Really, rather than trying to grow this church to be as large as it can be, to instead plant churches, to train people up, to send them out, and really to make sure that the gospel to make it clear that the gospel isn't dependent on a single person or a single church, and to plant churches so that the kind of ecosystem of this city will be stronger in 20, 30 years than if there were only kind of one big mega church. And that's both convictional because of our conviction of one service, one assembly, but it's also practical, that it will be more strategic for preserving gospel witnesses here in Washington, D.C. If there's 13, 12, 20 churches all faithfully preaching the gospel for decades to come.
Thanks. That's well said, brother. Last question is, in your last chapter is titled essentially 2000s to the present. And over the last few years, there have been a lot of people, and it's not everybody, right? There's sometimes people who have criticisms have outside voices. I understand that. But there have been some people who would share all of the vision of sort of like what's happening at Capitol Hill Baptist Church and what's being put forward by 9 Marks, who have found themselves at odds with or disagreeing with some of the political takes that have come out of either T4G or 9 Marks, or maybe what happened during the COVID era. I've certainly voiced some of those myself, even as a former member. Your last chapter is a little light, though. So as a historian, what was sort of your approach to dealing with CHBC sort of through the present era and some of these things that have caught a lot of people's attention in the national conversation?
Yeah, I kind of took the easy route out of that and kind of capped it at 2015 very conveniently. And part of that is just the cement is still so wet. It's really hard to put current events in historical perspective. And I even felt that way while working through the book, the history of the book. So I do hope to keep living history as well as writing about history. I'm still trying to make sense of the past decade myself. And hopefully there's more on that to come. But you're right. Just to be completely frank, I don't detail the last decade in its complexities, and that's work that'll have to be done and should be done.
Yeah, well said, brother. Appreciate that. Well, Caleb, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for this book. What would be sort of like a one sentence or two sentence summary of sort of the hope and the message that you would like to see people get out of this history of a life of a church? I noticed in Mark's introduction, he asked you, why would people read this? And you told him, because I'm telling it's like a biography, but instead of a person, it's the biography of a life of a church.
Yeah. The gospel will not be preserved apart from local churches, and local churches are worth investing in. It's worth investing your life, supporting the work of your local church to hand the gospel off to the next generation.
Well said, Caleb. And where can people find this book and follow your work?
Yeah, so the book is A Light on the Hill, published by Crossway, releases in April 2025. So you can find it on Amazon or at crossway.org or anywhere you buy your books.
Great. Thanks, Caleb. Thank you for joining us, brother.
Thank you, William.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.